Sometimes the people who need saving the most are the ones who spend their lives saving everyone else. Rain hammered against the dark waters of the Brooklyn Pier as icy wind swept across the empty docks. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, blurred by sheets of rain and scattered reflections dancing across the harbor. I should have been home hours ago. Instead, I sat alone beneath a rusted shelter near the edge of the pier, pulling my thin coat tighter around my shoulders as exhaustion settled deep into my bones. My feet ached from another 16-hour shift at the community clinic. My head pounded from lack of sleep. For months, every day had looked the same. Wake up. Work. Worry. Repeat. My father's medical bills continued growing faster than I could pay them. The clinic remained understaffed. My savings had disappeared long ago. Yet every morning I still smiled for patients because they deserved that much. The truth was simple. Everyone depended on me. I just did not have anyone to depend on. A sharp gust of wind rushed across the water. I closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The rain tapped against the metal roof above me like distant footsteps. Somewhere far away, a ship horn echoed through the harbor. Everything felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. I remember trying to stand. I remember the world tilting unexpectedly. Then I remember nothing at all. Across the waterfront, a black SUV rolled slowly along the service road beside the docks. Dominic Russo sat in the back seat reviewing reports on a tablet while city lights reflected across the tinted windows. Most nights he would have already been home. Tonight a delayed meeting had kept him near the harbor. The driver slowed unexpectedly. "Sir?" Dominic looked up. "What is it?" The driver pointed toward the shelter near the water. "Someone is sitting out there in this weather." Dominic glanced through the rain-streaked glass. At first, he saw only shadows. Then he noticed a figure slumped against a support beam. Motionless. Something tightened in his chest. "Stop the car." The SUV pulled over immediately. Rain soaked Dominic's coat the second he stepped outside. He barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the woman beneath the shelter. As he approached, recognition hit him instantly. Emma Carter. He had met her nearly a year earlier through a community health project his company funded. Kind. Stubborn. Always helping everyone around her. Always insisting she was fine. Even when she clearly was not. Emma. No response. Concern flashed across his face. He knelt beside her. Emma. Her eyes opened slightly before closing again. Relief and fear collided inside him at the same time. She was conscious. Barely. "Get medical assistance here now," he called toward the driver. His voice cut through the storm. A few moments later, Emma stirred weakly. Her lips moved. Dominic leaned closer to hear. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words made no sense. Sorry for what? Sorry for being exhausted? Sorry for carrying too much alone? Rain continued falling around them as Dominic removed his coat and carefully draped it over her shoulders. Then he looked at her face and felt something he had not expected. Not anger. Not frustration. Fear. Real fear. Because for the first time, he realized how close he had come to arriving too late. The first thing I noticed was the steady sound of a heart monitor. The second was the soft glow of morning sunlight filtering through partially closed blinds. For several seconds, I simply stared at the ceiling, trying to understand where I was. The smell of disinfectant answered before my memory did. Hospital. Slowly, pieces of the previous night returned. Rain. The pier. Exhaustion. Darkness. Then another memory surfaced. A voice calling my name. My head turned slightly toward the chair beside the bed. Dominic Russo sat there with his arms folded, his dark jacket draped across the back of the chair. He looked exhausted. His eyes were closed. For a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming. Men like Dominic did not spend entire nights sitting in hospital rooms. Yet there he was. The movement must have woken him because his eyes opened almost immediately. Relief crossed his face so quickly it nearly disappeared before I could process it. "You are awake." His voice sounded rough, as if he had not slept. I tried to sit up. A dull ache in my muscles immediately changed my mind. "How long?" I asked. "Since early this morning." I glanced toward the window. The sky was bright. You stayed. Dominic looked at me as though the answer should have been obvious. Of course I stayed. Something about the certainty in his voice made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I looked away first. You did not have to. Silence filled the room. Then I heard the chair scrape softly across the floor. Dominic leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Emma. His voice carried a weight I had never heard before. When I finally looked back at him, I saw something surprising. He was angry. Not the cold, controlled anger people associated with powerful men. Something deeper. More personal. Why? He asked quietly. I frowned. Why what? His jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked toward the window before meeting my eyes again. Why did you not call me? The question caught me completely off guard. Out of everything he could have said, I had not expected that. Dominic, no. His voice remained calm, but the emotion behind it was impossible to miss. I want to understand. The room suddenly felt smaller. The steady rhythm of the monitor filled the silence between us. You have my number. He shook his head slightly. You know where to find me. His eyes never left mine. So why were you sitting alone in the rain carrying all of this by yourself? I did not have an answer. At least not one that sounded reasonable when spoken out loud. Because I am used to it. Because asking for help feels like failure. Because everyone else always needed me more. None of those explanations seemed adequate. Dominic leaned back slowly. The anger in his expression faded, replaced by something far more unsettling. Fear. Do you know what I saw when I found you? He asked quietly. I swallowed. What? His gaze dropped briefly toward the floor. Someone who looked like she had spent too long pretending she was fine. The words landed harder than they should have. Because deep down, I knew he was right. And judging by the look in his eyes, Dominic Rousseau was not planning to let me hide from that truth anymore. The doctor discharged me 2 days later with strict instructions that sounded suspiciously similar to threats. Rest. Hydrate. Reduce stress. Sleep more. I almost laughed. If solving those problems were that easy, half the city would be healthy. Dominic drove me home himself. The entire ride felt strangely quiet. Rain clouds still lingered over Manhattan, casting silver shadows across the streets. Every few minutes I caught him glancing in my direction, as though he was making sure I had not disappeared. By the time we reached my apartment building, I was already preparing my argument. I am fine. Dominic stopped the engine. No. I sighed. Dominic. Emma. His calm voice somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could. We sat there for several seconds. Finally, he looked toward the apartment entrance. You work 16-hour shifts. Sometimes. You barely sleep. I looked out the window. Sometimes. You are helping your father financially. I turned back toward him. How do you know that? Regret flashed briefly across his face. I asked questions. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt tired. Too tired to defend problems that were obviously true. Dominic leaned back in his seat. You take care of everyone. His eyes met mine. Who takes care of you? The question followed me upstairs. It followed me into my apartment. It followed me through the evening while I watered plants, answered emails, and pretended nothing had changed. The problem was that something had changed. For the first time, someone had looked directly at the cracks I spent years hiding. And instead of stepping away, he stayed. 3 days later, I returned to the clinic. The familiar smell of coffee and antiseptic greeted me the second I walked through the door. Nurses waved. Patients smiled. Everything looked normal. Yet by noon I realized how exhausted I still felt. My body was present. My energy was not. During lunch, my phone vibrated. One message. Have you eaten today? I stared at the screen. Only Dominic would send a message that sounded like a parental inspection. Yes, I typed back. 2 minutes later another message arrived. An actual meal or coffee pretending to be lunch. I rolled my eyes so hard a coworker noticed. Bad date? She asked. Worse. How? I smiled despite myself. He is worried. The truth became impossible to ignore over the following weeks. Dominic never tried to control my decisions. He never ordered me to slow down. He simply appeared. A healthy dinner delivered after a late shift. A driver waiting outside during a storm. Fresh groceries left anonymously at my father's house until I discovered who was responsible. Every gesture carried the same message. You do not have to do everything alone. One evening, after another long day, I found myself standing outside the clinic watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold. My phone rang. Dominic. I answered immediately. Hello. Silence greeted me for a second. Then a relieved exhale. Good. I frowned. What? His voice softened. Nothing. Another pause. I just wanted to hear your voice and make sure you answered this time. Something inside my chest tightened unexpectedly. Because for the first time, I realized his fear had not disappeared at the pier. And neither had mine. Some burdens are heavy because of their size. Others are heavy because nobody knows you are carrying them. 2 days after the phone call, Dominic appeared outside the clinic just as my shift ended. The evening sky glowed pale orange above the city, and tired commuters filled the sidewalks. I spotted him leaning against a black SUV, hands in his pockets, watching the entrance. You know most people call before showing up, I said as I approached. A faint smile touched his face. I called yesterday. I laughed to spite myself. That is not how that works. He opened the passenger door. Dinner. That sounds suspiciously like an order. It sounds like concern. The answer followed me into the car. An hour later we sat in a quiet restaurant overlooking the East River. Soft lights reflected across the water, while distant boats drifted through the darkness. For a while we talked about simple things. Work. Patience. Community projects. Anything except the subjects both of us were avoiding. Eventually Dominic set down his glass and looked directly at me. Your father's treatment is falling behind. The statement froze me. You investigated my family? Regret crossed his face immediately. Emma. No. I looked away toward the river. You do not get to do that. Silence settled between us. Dominic waited until I looked back. I was worried. That does not give you the right. You are correct. The immediate agreement caught me off guard. Then why? His jaw tightened slightly. For several seconds, he searched for an answer. Because every time I asked how you were doing, you said you were fine. His voice remained calm. And every time, it was not true. The words landed harder than I wanted them to. I stared down at the table. Outside, city lights shimmered across the water. My father needs treatment, I admitted quietly. The insurance covers some of it. Saying the words out loud felt strangely exhausting. The rest comes from me. Dominic remained silent. Listening. The clinic is understaffed. I traced a finger along the edge of my glass. I pick up extra shifts whenever I can. The confession continued before I could stop it. Months of pressure slowly spilling into the open. Medical bills. Overtime. Constant worry. Endless responsibility. When I finally finished speaking, the restaurant seemed unusually quiet. Dominic stared at me for several seconds. Not with pity. Something else. Heartbreak. Emma. His voice was barely above a whisper. How long have you been carrying all of that alone? I looked down. A while. He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. That is not a while. His eyes never left mine. That is too long. For the first time, I could not argue. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The exhaustion had not started at the pier. It had started months earlier. Maybe years. Dominic reached across the table and rested his hand over mine. The gesture was simple. Steady. Safe. You do not have to prove your strength by suffering alone. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Outside, the river continued moving beneath the city lights. Inside, something else shifted. For the first time in years, I allowed someone to see how tired I really was. And judging by the look in Dominic's eyes, he was not going anywhere. The strange thing about accepting help is that it feels uncomfortable long before it feels comforting. For the next several days, I found myself arguing with Dominic more than usual. Not because he was being unreasonable. The opposite. Every time I turned around, he was quietly solving problems I had spent months fighting alone. A specialist called my father with an earlier appointment. A transportation service suddenly became available for his treatments. The clinic received a donation that allowed several exhausted nurses to finally receive additional support staff. Dominic never announced any of it. He never asked for credit. Somehow that made it harder to protest. One afternoon, I arrived at my father's apartment carrying groceries and found him sitting by the window smiling at something on his phone. "You look happy," I said. He laughed softly. "I had a visitor." My stomach immediately sank. "Dominic." My father pointed toward me. "That man worries about you more than I do." I set the grocery bags on the counter. "That is impossible. Trust me." He smiled. "It is not." The conversation stayed with me all evening. So did something else. Every person Dominic helped seemed to matter to him. The clinic staff, my father, community programs, even people he would never meet personally. It contradicted everything I thought I knew about powerful men. A week later, I finally confronted him. We were walking along the waterfront near sunset, the same harbor where everything had changed. The air smelled faintly of salt water and rain. Boats drifted slowly across the river while the city glowed gold behind us. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Dominic glanced toward me. "Doing what?" "Helping." He smiled slightly. "That narrows it down." I stopped walking. "I am serious." The smile faded. For several moments, he simply looked out across the water. "Because somebody should have helped you sooner." The answer caught me completely off guard. "Dominic." He shook his head. "No speeches." His voice remained calm. "No arguments." A breeze swept across the harbor. "You spent years carrying responsibilities that would exhaust anyone." He looked directly at me. "And somehow you convinced yourself that asking for support was weakness." I looked away first, because part of me knew he was right. The silence stretched comfortably between us as we resumed walking. Then my phone rang. The clinic. I answered immediately. A coworker explained that one of our long-term patients needed assistance navigating a complicated insurance issue. Before she even finished speaking, I was already offering to help. After the call ended, Dominic laughed quietly. "There it is." I frowned. "What?" "You." He shoved his hands into his pockets. "Someone asks for help and you immediately show up." I smiled despite myself. "That is my job." "No." His eyes softened. "That is who you are." Something warm settled inside my chest. Not because of the compliment. Because for the first time, someone seemed to understand me without needing an explanation. We reached the end of the pier as the sun disappeared below the skyline. Lights flickered on across the city. The water reflected them like scattered stars. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Dominic looked toward the harbor and quietly made a promise I was not sure he realized he had spoken aloud. "You are not carrying this alone anymore." And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to believe him. Some wounds leave scars. Others leave habits. The hardest habit to break is believing you must face every problem alone. A few days after our walk along the harbor, I found myself sitting beside my father's bed while afternoon sunlight streamed through the apartment windows. He looked stronger than he had in months. Color had returned to his face. His treatment was helping. For the first time in a long time, hope felt real. "You are thinking too much," he said. I smiled. "You always know." He laughed softly. "You get that from your mother." The mention of her immediately quieted the room. My mother had been gone for nearly 10 years. Even now, the loss felt strangely close. My father studied me for a moment. "You never told him, did you?" I looked away. "Told who?" "Dominic." I already knew where the conversation was going. "There is nothing to tell." My father gave me a look that suggested he had tolerated enough nonsense for one afternoon. "Emma." I sighed. "When Mom got sick, people promised they would help." The words emerged before I could stop them. Friends. Relatives. Neighbors. Sunlight reflected softly across the room as old memories surfaced. Everyone meant well. My voice lowered. But one by one, they disappeared. My father remained silent. Listening. The bills kept coming. I stared down at my hands. The responsibilities kept growing. A familiar ache settled inside my chest. Eventually, I learned it was easier not to expect anyone to stay. The room fell quiet. The truth hung between us. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just honest. Later that evening, Dominic picked me up for dinner. We drove through Manhattan beneath a sky painted with streaks of orange and purple. Traffic moved slowly through the city while music played quietly through the speakers. For most of the ride, neither of us spoke. Eventually, he glanced toward me. "You look far away." I stared out the window. "Maybe I am." He did not push. That was one of the things I had come to appreciate about him. Dominic knew when to ask questions. More importantly, he knew when not to. We ended up at a quiet restaurant overlooking Central Park. Candlelight flickered softly across the tables. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Safe. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, I finally told him. About my mother. About the promises people could not keep. About learning to rely only on myself because disappointment hurt less than hope. Dominic listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat quietly for several seconds. Then he looked directly at me. "That explains it." I frowned. "Explains what?" His expression softened. "Why you run the second someone tries to help." I laughed weakly. "I do not run." One eyebrow lifted. "Emma." The reaction made me smile despite myself. Dominic reached for his glass before speaking again. "You learned that depending on people was dangerous." His voice remained gentle. But that lesson came from the wrong people. Something about those words hit harder than expected. Because deep down, I had always known he was right. The city lights glowed beyond the restaurant windows as silence settled between us. Then Dominic spoke again. Quietly. "Honestly. I am not asking you to carry less because you are weak." His eyes met mine. "I am asking because you were never supposed to carry all of it by yourself." And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what life would feel like if I actually believed him. Some truths change everything the moment they are spoken aloud. Others change you because they remain unspoken for far too long. A week after our dinner near Central Park, autumn finally arrived in New York. The air carried a crisp chill. Leaves painted the sidewalks in shades of gold and amber. Life at the clinic felt lighter than it had in months. Additional staff had arrived. Patient wait times were shorter. For the first time in years, I occasionally left work before sunset. Everyone called it good luck. I knew better. Dominic never discussed his involvement, but I recognized his fingerprints on every improvement. One Friday evening, I found him standing on the rooftop terrace of one of his waterfront buildings. The city stretched endlessly behind him. Thousands of lights shimmered beneath the darkening sky. "You spend a lot of time staring at New York," I said as I approached. A faint smile appeared. "The city never lies." I laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." "It sounds old." The answer made me smile. We stood quietly beside the railing while traffic moved like streams of light below. Eventually, I noticed something unusual. Dominic seemed distracted. Not worried. Not angry. Just distant. "What happened?" I asked. He looked surprised. "Nothing." That was not convincing. His smile faded. For several seconds, he watched the skyline. Then he exhaled slowly. "Do you remember what I asked you in the hospital?" I nodded immediately. The question had never left me. "Why did you not call me?" Dominic lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. "There is a reason I reacted that way." The city noise seemed to fade into the background. Something in his voice told me this mattered. A lot. Years ago, he continued, I had a younger brother. I remained silent. Listening. "Anthony." A small smile appeared at the memory. "He was smarter than me. Funnier too." The affection in his voice felt immediate. Real. One night, he got into trouble. Dominic's gaze remained fixed on the skyline. Nothing dramatic. Nothing impossible to fix. His hands tightened slightly against the railing. But he thought he could handle it himself. My chest tightened. The pieces were already falling into place. He did not call anyone. Dominic's voice grew quieter. "Not me. Not family. Nobody." The wind moved gently across the rooftop. By the time I learned what was happening, it was too late to help. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. Honest. I looked at him differently in that moment. For months, I had assumed his protectiveness came from power. Influence. Responsibility. Now I understood something deeper. It came from loss. Dominic stared out at the city for several more seconds before finally turning toward me. When I found you at the pier. His voice caught slightly before he continued. For a moment, I thought history was repeating itself. Emotion tightened in my throat. Suddenly, everything made sense. The fear in the hospital. The constant phone calls. The insistence that I stop carrying everything alone. None of it had been about control. It had been about terror. Terror of losing someone else because they suffered in silence. Before I could think about what I was doing, I stepped closer and gently took his hand. Dominic looked down, surprised. Then back at me. I am here, I said quietly. For simple words. Yet, something shifted in his expression. The tension he had carried for years seemed to ease, if only slightly. The city lights reflected in his eyes as a small smile appeared. And standing above Manhattan beneath a sky full of stars, I realized that sometimes healing begins the moment two people finally stop facing their fears alone. The hardest part about learning to trust someone is not deciding whether they will stay. It is deciding whether you will let them. The weeks that followed felt different. Not because life suddenly became easy. Problems still existed. My father still had treatments. The clinic still faced challenges. Long days still happened. But for the first time, I no longer felt like I was carrying the entire world by myself. One crisp Saturday morning, I arrived at the community clinic expecting an ordinary day. Instead, I found volunteers decorating the entrance with banners and flowers. Patients smiled as they entered. Staff members hurried through the halls with unusual excitement. What is happening? I asked one of the nurses. She grinned. You seriously forgot? I stared at her blankly. Forgot what? Her expression shifted to disbelief. Emma. A few minutes later, I learned the answer. The clinic's annual community appreciation event. In previous years, I had always helped organize it. This year, between work, family responsibilities, and exhaustion, the date had completely escaped me. By noon, the building was full. Families gathered in the courtyard. Children played games. Volunteers distributed food and information about health programs. Laughter echoed through the autumn air. Standing in the middle of it all, I felt something unfamiliar. Pride. Not for myself. For the community. For everything people could accomplish when they helped one another. Around mid-afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. My heart recognized it before my eyes did. Dominic stepped out wearing a dark coat and carrying a small folder. The moment several staff members spotted him, they immediately approached to thank him for recent donations. Dominic handled the attention exactly the way he always did. Briefly. Politely. Then he escaped toward me. You look busy, he said. I laughed. You look guilty. One eyebrow lifted. Guilty? I pointed toward the volunteers. You funded half of this event, did not you? A smile appeared. Maybe. I shook my head. You are impossible. For a while, we walked through the event together. Patients stopped to share stories. Families introduced children who had benefited from clinic programs. Elderly residents thanked staff members for years of support. Dominic listened to every single person. Not because he had to. Because he genuinely cared. That realization stayed with me throughout the afternoon. Eventually, as the event began winding down, one of the directors approached carrying a framed photograph. We wanted to give this to both of you. She handed it over. The image showed volunteers, nurses, patients, and families gathered together outside the clinic. Hundreds of smiling faces. A community connected by kindness. My eyes immediately found Dominic standing beside me near the center of the picture. The director smiled. Some people change organizations. Her gaze moved between us. Others change lives. After she left, neither of us spoke for several seconds. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Children laughed in the distance. Leaves drifted across the courtyard. Finally, I looked at Dominic. Thank you. His expression softened. For what? I smiled. For staying. The answer seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the powerful man everyone else saw disappeared completely. In his place stood someone honest. Someone vulnerable. Someone who had spent months helping me heal while quietly healing himself. Dominic looked toward the photograph before meeting my eyes again. Emma. His voice was warm. Steady. Certain. I am not planning on going anywhere. And for the first time, instead of fearing that promise, I believed it. 1 year later, the sound that changed everything was not a siren, a warning, or a storm. It was a phone ringing. I stood outside a newly opened community wellness center overlooking the Brooklyn waterfront as sunlight reflected across the harbor. Families filled the courtyard. Volunteers greeted visitors. Children chased one another between tables decorated with blue and white ribbons. The center had become a reality after months of planning. Free health resources, counseling services, family support programs. Everything the community needed in one place. My phone vibrated in my hand. Without hesitation, I smiled and answered. Hi, where are you? Dominic's voice carried the familiar warmth that had become part of my everyday life. I looked toward the entrance where people continued arriving. Outside. Good. A pause followed. Stay there. I laughed softly. That sounds suspicious. Trust me. 10 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the parking area. Dominic stepped out wearing a dark suit and immediately searched the crowd until his eyes found mine. Some things never changed. The moment he reached me, he handed over a small envelope. What is this? I asked. Open it. Inside was a photograph. My breath caught instantly. It showed the waterfront pier from 1 year earlier. Not the storm. Not the fear. The sunrise afterward. Calm water. Golden light. A new beginning. Written across the back were 6 simple words. Thank you for making the call. Emotion tightened in my throat. Dominic. He smiled. Do you know what today means? I nodded slowly. Exactly 1 year since the night everything changed. 1 year since the pier. 1 year since I learned that strength and loneliness were not the same thing. Around us, guests continued arriving for the center's grand opening. My father stood nearby speaking with volunteers, healthier and happier than I had seen him in years. The clinic was thriving. The community programs were expanding. Life was not perfect, but it was good. Better than I once believed possible. Dominic looked toward the building before turning back to me. You know what I remember most about that night? I shook my head. What? His eyes softened. Not finding you. The answer surprised me. Then what? A small smile appeared, realizing how much I wanted you to stay. For a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade away. The harbor sparkled behind him. The same water. The same city. Yet everything felt different now. Because neither of us was standing alone anymore. I reached for his hand. He immediately held mine. No hesitation. No fear. Just certainty. The ceremony began a few minutes later. Applause filled the courtyard as families entered the new center for the first time. Hope lived in every smile, every conversation, every open door. Standing beside Dominic, I realized something important. A year ago, I thought surviving meant carrying everything myself. I was wrong. Sometimes surviving means making the call. Sometimes healing means answering it. And sometimes the person who saves your life is not the one who carries your burdens. It is the one who refuses to let you carry them alone. As the afternoon sun bathed the waterfront in gold, Dominic squeezed my hand gently, and together we walked forward into the life we had built, not from fear or loss, but from trust, hope, and a promise neither of us would ever have to face the future alone again.